Well, there are three things that your viewers need to understand. First of all, money into defense does not necessarily produce capability on the other end. Just spending money doesn't equal capability. We spend far too much for what we get in most cases. In some cases, we spend a great deal, and we do get a good return on investment. I think that's particularly true in surveillance, intelligence, reconnaissance, platforms, and capabilities, but many other areas we simply don't. So that's the first problem. Second problem is that, your current military establishment remains tragically a brilliant tribute to the Second World War. We're still building surface fleets around aircraft carrier battle groups. We're still fielding large, ponderous army divisions that are too heavy to move, too heavy to lift. But even worse, the world doesn't fight that way anymore. And that's one of the things that we have to pay attention to what's been happening in Ukraine, because it fundamentally changes the way you look at things. That's a huge problem. And then you've got the threat inflation industry. You want to keep this monstrous military establishment running, and you keep insisting it's vitally necessary, because if anything isn't spent for 10 cents less or 10 billion less, you're at risk of being conquered and overrun and destroyed. By whom? Well, we go back to Russia. Russia presents no substantial threat to us unless, of course, we decide to attack Russia. They have an enormous nuclear arsenal. We have an enormous nuclear arsenal. We can kill each other and most of the people on the planet several times over. We don't want to use nuclear weapons. I see no evidence that Mr. Putin does. That's kind of a dumb way to look at it. Secondly, we continue to see Russia through the Cold War lens. Everyone keeps acting as though it's the Soviet Union. It's not. Russia's a very different country today. China, people can go, the Communist Party of China is doing this and this, and the Communist Party of China. The Communist Party of China is a joke. The Communist Party of China is just an elite organization, a cabal of people across the country that run the government and try to control 1.4 billion people, which is pretty damn difficult to do. They're not communists. I haven't seen very many communists in Northeast Asia whenever I've been over there to visit. The Chinese are money-grubbing people, let's face it. They are absolutely committed to profit at all costs. So I don't see much evidence for communism. I see a lot of evidence for capitalism. But I don't see evidence for Chinese armies massing on anybody's border to invade anybody. And when they look at their naval power, remember, a third of all the ships that they have floating around in the South China Sea are Coast Guard vessels. So, all right, what are we really dealing with? Are we really genuinely facing existential threats from China and Russia? And I think the president last night said it very well. He said, no. He said, our problems are here at home. And they are. So you have this group of people in Washington who seem to be ready to do anything to sustain these massive outlays in spending, not just defense, but also in entitlements, as you know. And we continue to pretend as though the Social Security system, Medicare, Medicaid, pension plans, all these things are solid. They're not. We know they're not. We pretend that the banks are solvent and not illiquid. They're not. I mean, remember back, I think it was December or November last year, all of these, stress tests were run on banks. Everyone's like, oh, well, we're in pretty good shape. That wasn't true. Right. We are continuing to mislead ourselves in order to sustain this tremendous spending. Well, when does it stop? Well, I think, Ben Stein who said things go on until they can't? Mm-hmm. When did the British leave India? When their debt to GDP ratio was 240%? In other words, I'm afraid that the so-called ruling elites in Washington, D.C. are just going to drive us into the ground. And I hope that before then, if I have to choose between hyperinflation and default in terms of restructuring the debt, I'd rather go with the restructuring as opposed to hyperinflation. But they're all going to be painful. And no one wants to tell the American people the truth. Just as these documents have come out and told us we're losing in Ukraine, the Ukrainians are not going to win, Ukraine is being destroyed. We have the same problem at home. Our financial system is being destroyed by us.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about China. First of all, what do you make of the meeting between President Xi Jinping and President Emmanuel Macron of France? And what does that mean for geopolitics, given everything you've just covered?
Well, when you see President Xi stop thinking about communism, forget that, and think of him as the contemporary emperor of China. China is an empire unto itself, much as we are on the North American continent, frankly. But China is an imperial state, not with goals and objectives to conquer the world, because they've got 1.4 billion people. They've got enough. You know, as a Japanese commander, after a couple of years in China in the 1930s, turned to the emperor and said, you know, the problem in China is there's nothing in it but Chinese. In other words, what are we doing here? This is crazy. And the Japanese were trying to get out. The point is that Xi looks at Macron and sees Macron as a potential trading partner. Remember, China's focus is to the restoration of this thing called the Silk Road.
Right.
And you have several sort of lines of communication that run across the map. They all run through Central Asia. Some run down south through what we used to call Persia, Iran, or into Turkey and then the Middle East. But most of them really are from Northeast Asia, from Shanghai to Beijing, all the way to Rochefort in France on the Atlantic coast. Now, why is this so important? It's important because we have the most powerful submarine fleet in the world. We may have a shrinking surface fleet, but surface fleets don't fight battles and win wars the way they did 200 years ago. Today, everything is a function of the submarine at sea, its ability to essentially neutralize you, put you out of business. Nothing comes in, nothing goes out of a port if we decide to put a submarine out there at sea. And you have the overhead surveillance, which is connected to everything on the ground and connected to all sorts of platforms. So this is readily available as a tool for us. If we decided to shut down Chinese ports, we could do it. China knows that and has known that for a very long time. They went through this with the Royal Navy back in the 1840s and even earlier. So what have the Chinese concluded? Well, we need to bypass the maritime route to the extent that we can. And they're very dependent on it. They will be for many years to come through the Strait of Malacca up into the South China Sea. Food, energy through that strait up into China. But if you build this network across Central Asia that reaches to Europe, that's a game changer because Russia has all the energy in the world that you could possibly need. So if you're suddenly cut off, you've got it. Russia has most of the food that you're going to need to eat as well, along with Ukraine. You look at that entire area, it's a food production center on a scale that very few people in the West appreciate. There's a reason, you know, we used to call it Ukraine the breadbasket of Europe. So the bottom line is, this is a very important development, this One Belt, One Road project. And the Europeans, of course, want to trade with China. Well, why wouldn't they? I mean, China's the biggest market in the world, or one of the biggest. This is inevitable, and we're sitting there trying to stop it. Are we nuts? The answer is yes, of course. But we've also missed our opportunity because we have an advantage over the Chinese. When the Chinese want to move across Central Asia, they've got to go through multiple countries, multiple states, where people speak multiple languages, have different laws and customs. And as you move through each state, everybody has their hand out and says, please, money, please, because you're going to go through this. We have missed the opportunity to build something right across North America, from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific coast. We could outpace China or anybody else in Asia anytime we wanted to if we had fast sea lift in the Pacific, fast sea lift in the Atlantic, and speedy trains right across North America. And what else? It's secure. One language, one law, one people, one nation. Faster, cheaper, better. What have we done? Nothing.
Well, it looks like instead we're just moving in that same direction of more intimidation, raising tensions. You've said in interviews before that China doesn't want war with us and that our leaders in Washington do not understand the priorities of leaders like Xi, their cultures, their people. So what do you think should happen next versus what do you think will happen, and what's really at stake here with China?
Well, let's talk about what we should understand about both Taiwan and China, because they both have the same aspirations, the same goals, frankly. Chinese everywhere want to live in a society, in a state, in a world that looks like Singapore. Now, what's interesting about Singapore? Well, most Americans would go to Singapore, look around, and live there for a couple of days and be horrified. Everything in Singapore is really controlled by the government. You know, you're not going to just show up in Singapore, buy 20 acres and build something. Effectively, the government leases everything to you, and they have very strict laws and regulations governing everything. But what do they not do? Well, they don't tax you to death per se. In other words, if you're wealthy enough to get there to begin with, they're not going to steal it from you. But they provide you with a marketplace, whereas from the Chinese vantage point, which is ideal, no one interferes with you, no one bothers you, you have the freedom to enrich yourself. And that's very important to most Chinese. Remember, China is a part of the world where people have died by the millions from all sorts of famines and problems over many, many centuries. They just want to live unencumbered by the government and do business. Now, they also have a huge problem with corruption, much greater than we in the United States understand. Someone told me the other day they estimated that on Taiwan alone, there are probably 100 gangsters with connections to Japan, Korea, and China. So the corruption is a huge problem. And Xi may control many things, but he can't even control the corruption inside China. He can't stop everything from moving on any given day. I mean, he's limited just by the size and scope of the country. So the point is, no, they don't want war with us. They don't want war with anybody. They just want to do business. But the Singapore model is really what both Taiwanese and Chinese want. Now, we can't conceive of that. So we project our views, our values, our mentality onto them. And the outcome is this utterly misleading view that China is armed to the teeth and can't wait to invade Taiwan. For your listeners out there, look, Taiwan is hell to invade. They have very few beaches where you can land, and they're very small. You're talking about sheer rock face around most of the island's edges. It's very difficult to reach, difficult to get on board. And by the way, the Chinese don't want to destroy what's on Taiwan. They want to do business with it. They have investments there. And the Taiwanese are heavily invested in China. So all of this war business just needs to stop. And I think if we shut up and get out of the way, this will sort itself out over the next several years. But in Asia, of course, things take time. We're the instant pudding world, which is insane. We want everything immediately. In Asia, it may be 10 years, maybe 20 years. Xi said that they were looking at 2040 or 2043 or 2046 as reunification with the people on Taiwan. It'll probably happen.